We've got about 15 minutes for the conversation on containers. This has been a long-running one for us. Very happy for the first time to, I think, officially have Chris Aniszczyk on the FinOps Foundation call.
I'm not completely up to speed on exactly what we're discussing here.
Oh, that looks like I need to mute everybody. That was not Chris. So Chris is the guy who brought us into the Linux Foundation. Chris, you have, I think, the longest list of presently open job roles that I've ever seen on here. I don't know how you come up with all of it, but thank you for making the time to talk about the new survey results and cover our panel. I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, cool. You're steering, I'm assuming.
Yeah, will do.
Oh, awesome. So yeah, great to meet everyone here. Like JR said, I think it's been at least a couple of years since we had our first discussion before the FinOps Foundation became part of the Linux Foundation family of foundations. I had the fun job of starting a sister organization called the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which is all dedicated to containers, Kubernetes, orchestration, kind of let's call it the software building blocks and open source projects that kind of companies use to kind of run their infrastructure on scale. So, a little bit less practitioner focused, more kind of developer code focused, but definitely a lot of overlap as a lot of people in our community are, deploying the software, using it at scale, and essentially running into cost management issues and figuring out how to do chargeback and all this stuff. So it's kind of a great overlap we have amongst the organizations. And one of our first initial collaborations was this essentially FinOps for Kubernetes survey that we put together. We have essentially a panel here today also that will have some questions to discuss. I don't know if you want to discuss Kapil and Vittorio, JR, before I kind of dive into the quick.
Yeah, could each of you do a quick 30-second intro, and then we'll get into the content questions.
Yeah, we actually, we definitely have.
All right, sorry, folks, 1 second. I'm going to hard mute everybody, and then I'm going to unmute the speakers.
No, I don't.
Because for some reason.
It's muting me. I don't know why it's muting.
1 second. This is the blessing and the curse of having the open call, is sometimes we get a little overlap.
There, is that better? Yep, that's fine. Yeah.
Kapil, can you go ahead and kick on?
I think there's a guy named Martin Feltz that keeps going on.
Yeah,
and
I
off.
just
So you could just
call, so
perfect, beautiful.
All right. Don't be Martin, guys. All right, go ahead.
Hey everyone, pleasure to be here. I'm Kapil Sharma. I'm the Senior Engineering Manager for a cost transparency team at Expedia Group. I'm responsible for helping build in-house multi-cloud FinOps platform for Expedia, and I've been at it for the last couple of years now.
Hey, Vittorio Barris here from Cerence. I've been heading the FinOps practice at our company from going from a lift and shift monolith all the way into a Kubernetes stack, container-based software stack, and been focused on financial goals, but now we're really getting into efficiencies through our containers.
Oops, Chris, I think I muted you in that moment. Let me get you unmuted here. There you go. Should be
awesome. No, awesome, cool. Yeah, so we'll go over some of the kind of the results from the survey, and to me it's a little bit fascinating. Our community was asking for essentially more data, more input from how people are actually doing cost management in Kubernetes land, because historically the cloud native world, from the CNCF context, a lot of developers were just used to they were very excited that they didn't have to kind of deal with the old world of, provisioning infrastructure, going through Jira tickets or all this thing. They could just go willy-nilly spin up, Kubernetes namespaces and go without any, effect until the finance folks chased after them. And so we were trying to get some data, from, hey, how are people doing this within our, community? What lessons can we kind of share and just kind of start the conversation, overall. So I'll go through this fairly quick before asking our panel here. So the first kind of, item is like, obviously the last year, everyone's been, seeing an increased amount of spend. JR, I think it's the previous slide. I think you jumped a little bit ahead. There we go. So, no surprise here, definitely in the last 12 months, everyone's kind of seen a jump in cost. Kubernetes, folks also. So Kubernetes spend has kind of grown more than kind of 2/3 overall, with about half of those folks seeing more than a 20% jump in their overall spend. And if you go to the next slide, obviously most of the spend comes from compute. This should be kind of no surprise. It's kind of where a good portion of the workloads. I did expect a little bit more on the storage side, but this is basically asking about 200 people from our rough community on response. So the sample size is not the largest, but here's your kind of rough idea of what people are spending money on. Let's go to the next.
Anecdotally, this really aligns to what I've seen, like in infrastructure as a service as well, like compute tends to be 80%. So
I mean, that's where the clouds make the money, to be honest, these days. But yeah, that's interesting to know. So let's move forward. So this is a little interesting thing. So 25% of folks really don't do any form of cost monitoring, and I have some theories around this. It could be the maturity of the tools, lack of open source options, and so on. Very few people implement chargeback. That's also a non-trivial thing. I didn't include this in my introduction, but I spent 5 years working on Twitter's open source infrastructure before kind of cloud native and containers were kind of hip, and chargeback was just painful to implement, in that scale organization. So we had to build a lot of homegrown stuff. Hopefully that improves over time, I think, as the tooling matures. Let's go to the next slide. Bill prediction, oddly, like everyone, thinks a good chunk of people thought bill prediction was important, but 25%, don't do it. I'm kind of curious how this maps in kind of just the cloud world only, and not only kind of the Kubernetes focus, but, I think part of this kind of deals with, tools and not having kind of like maybe a strong FinOps culture within the organization. Let's move forward, given a little sensitive time. This was a little bit interesting for me. Like, I'd expect, I expected a little bit more stronger, cloud specific tool usage here. Obviously AWS, rules the roost, given, they're kind of fairly dominant in the Kubernetes world. We have KubeCost, which is kind of mixed open source, vendor-based tool, accountability, so you gotta have a mix of everything. Homegrown tool and spreadsheets still kind of make up, I think, around 25% or so of what people are using, which I think maps to about, I think in this data.finops survey, I think it was about a third were like straight up doing, spreadsheets, still. So yeah, I think, fairly, no dominant winner here at all. And another interesting to think about, like from a Kubernetes context, a big portion of the original motivation outside of just resource efficiency was truly to build something that is multi-cloud specific. So I think what you're seeing here is there's just not, really good kind of multi-cloud options, here. So people are using what they could find on the cloud, and then usually finding another maybe vendor or homegrown built tool to kind of work across clouds to kind of handle their cost management needs. Okay, next slide. I think we are ready for some kind of takeaways and questions for our esteemed panelists. So yeah, spending is up, no surprise here. People think predicting cloud bills are important, but 38% of them can't, or 30% of them could only really truly do it within 10% margins, and about a fifth of them just can't do it, at all. The other thing kind of came up was just the kind of lack of open source options to kind of get started with for projects. In the CNCF world, this is kind of important since it's kind of a very developer first area. So people are going to complain about this. And as I mentioned, about 25% kind of usage of homegrown tools and spreadsheets. So let me ask, a few questions for, our panelists to kind of, get started. So, Kubernetes kind of came around to kind of push the notion of, multi-cloud, abstract a notion of you working directly with machines. So developers think in terms of like, services, deployments, and so on, not specific machines or IPs. Has the notion of adopting Kubernetes, within your organization or practice impacted, how you handle FinOps essentially, and essentially has it made you more efficient? I don't know, I think Kapil was talking about this a little bit yesterday for BN, and so it'd be great to kind of hear from an Expedia point of view, given that you used a bunch of tools, orchestration tools since day one. So, is Kapil unmuted?
Kapil, you should be.
Thanks, Jeff.
There we go.
Yeah, Yeah, it definitely has, it has definitely upped the expectation from our developers as well. Now that they are able to run the infrastructure so easily, right? They also want that simplicity in their estimation of the cost, because since we have abstracted the concept of the different machine types, now what they expect is a simple unit cost of the infrastructure as well. That if I deploy an application for X number of CPUs and X number of memory, what would be the cost, right? So definitely it has pushed us as a central team, which is providing that kind of reporting functionality, to think about more uniform cost models as well.
Awesome. Vittorio, anything to say on?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, from our perspective, I think the basic structures that we set up for Showback before Kubernetes are being applied at the namespace team level within the clusters, so that we can extract the right cost binning, and also being able to understand the CPU to memory ratios was very important to keep visibility up there and play fair, if you will, through different clouds.
So Vittorio, you mentioned you kind of broke things, apart by namespace and so on. So I'm kind of curious, how, what are you seeing in the field, or how is Expedia kind of doing this, where, Kubernetes is very flexible with its kind of label structure and namespace thing, where you could kind of, label whatever the hell you want. You could break things apart by environment, like dev versus prod, or you could do it by team, product. You could potentially even try to make it work down to like application level. Do you have kind of any lessons to share, maybe from like an Expedia level, couple on kind of the challenges you face and kind of what you've come up with that works, at least for a large scale organization like yours?
Yeah, I think tagging
standards.
Go
ahead.
Kapil first.
Sure. So from the tagging standpoint, is, as you said, right, implementing the tagging standards has always been a challenge, because different teams are also running their own Kubernetes infrastructure, and they're all following their own tagging standards. And but the good thing is they're all collecting the same level of metrics at container level, task level, instance level, as well as the namespace level. So what we do is we allow that capability to slice and dice the data in different ways and forms, depending on the developer or team's comfort level, regardless, trying to force the same tagging standard. What we still have is a concept of a logical application, where everything ties to a logical metadata application, which is registered in the central metadata repository. And that way is when we are trying to look up the cost from a finance perspective, it is able to roll up at the cost center or department level and stuff like that. Vittorio, you want to add?
Nope, can't hear you. There you go.
There we go. Okay. Yeah, completely agreed. In our case, we have squads following the SRE model, and we established a requirement for labeling and metrics, so that we have uniformity across the teams and how they label their Kubernetes containers.
Cool. One interesting, question I have is, at least from, container orchestration land, there's been kind of multi-generations, of the technology, right? I spent my early, infrastructure career of doing, we built Mesos at Twitter, right? It was kind of this is pre-Kubernetes days, right? There was some companies that were taking the leap into containers before, things were maybe very, mature, or people are just using, straight up, kernel, C groups and so on, to kind of build their own layer. When we were talking yesterday, Kapil, you mentioned that I think Expedia went a similar journey, where you adopted a little bit of, maybe Mesos in the beginning, Nomad, and eventually, maybe Kubernetes. How is that kind of journey amongst these kind of different container platforms? Like, have you had to change essentially how you implement your FinOps practices amongst these different tools? Were there any lessons to kind of carry, amongst these changes?
I think instead of changing, it was kind of evolving, that we figured out a lot of shared patterns across different deployments, and that helped us actually implement common APIs to ingest the metrics that we need to charge back the customers on, because for a customer point of view, at the end of the day, they are still talking about the unit cost of a CPU and memory in that respective platform. So we started evolving our chargeback model according to the same standards, and make it simpler for them to move around from Mesos to Nomad to Kubernetes-based platforms. And same thing for the tagging as well, as I said, right? That we introduced that concept of logical applications, which is registered in the metadata system, so that users have, if the same application is deployed in the two different systems, they can compare one-on-one using the unit cost of it.
Awesome. So another interesting question. So, when people generally, move to Kubernetes, I've seen, this notion of like, let's build a multi-cloud, solution. Some people are using it across clouds, whether using the native Kubernetes service or just running it on, EC2 themselves and managing it there. And then also bridging the, they maybe had a lot of private data centers and kind of a whole, colo setup, right? And they're trying to bridge all those worlds. So, as you're aware, like, I don't know, figuring out the cost of like a Kubernetes cluster, on kind of an on-prem, colo setup is a little bit more difficult, right? You kind of have price in capital expenditure and all that stuff. Like, how have the both of you seen like any interesting ways of doing that, or how you essentially, handle that challenge, essentially kind of bridging those two worlds?
Vittorio, you want to go first?
Oh yeah, on-prem and cloud-based. Have you seen?
Yeah, so we've actually moved entirely to public cloud, and we left the on-prem behind us. So that was quite a big move, and so I'm kind of happy to say I haven't had to deal with that.
You're blessed.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, in our case, like we are moving to the cloud completely as well, but there is still a private cloud concept that we have in case we need to move things around. But that chargeback of that private cloud-based Kubernetes platform is still kind of on a back burner. We are more focused on the cloud version because that's what drives the majority of the cost.
Okay, so I guess the solution is basically we care less because that's essentially something that will be deprecated long
More
term
static, more static as well, right? So.
Yep. Very cool. And then given I think I have another minute. Any kind of final like lessons to kind of share for folks that are essentially trying to implement FinOps practices on Kubernetes. Like any kind of final nugget that you want to share with folks. This is the first time we're kind of doing this survey. The JR and crew at the FinOps Foundation is going to kind of take it over and kind of grow and include it in their overall data FinOps report, but any nuggets of wisdom or lessons that you kind of want to leave folks as they kind of go ahead and then kind of implement the Kubernetes and container-based cost monitoring.
Yeah, from my side, I can share that the focus should be on consistency of the chargeback model, because if you're doing a daily unit rate or a monthly unit rate, even that won't fly for a long amount of time. So the focus should be on once you have enough amount of usage in the cloud on the container platforms, start driving towards coming up with a unit rate that you can keep static, let's say for a quarter or a couple of months, because that really helps in predictability of the spend for your end consumers, because they would need to forecast the cost and provide the forecast to the finance teams. And if your unit rate is changing on a daily basis, even without the usage changing for the consumer, they're going to be pissed off really. Right, so the main focus should be on keeping the unit cost static as possible.
Vittorio, any final thoughts?
Yeah, so from my side, I think one of the big focuses that we have is efficiency, and also looking at the waste and idle cost in the clusters, and continually trying to improve that, as well as proper allocation, fair allocation for shared services, which should also we should also look at not just the shared services, but how the idle cost is shared across them and has to be fair. Also the auto scaling components and how to apply savings programs to systems that use auto scaling properly.
Awesome. Thanks for the time and sharing your thoughts. My challenge to the group out here is saluting the vendors and members. I personally would love to see more open source options out there to help kind of democratize and help people get started implementing proper FinOps practice. I do think it's a missing hole, and we could all do better as a community there. But thank you, JR, for giving the opportunity for me to present our little micro survey on Kubernetes and FinOps.
Thank you all for that. As Chris mentioned, we're going to pick this up and make it part of the State of FinOps report next time around. So we'll have a deeper dive into Kubernetes. You see that current report there. Shout out on open source tools. Spotify has Backstage, which CNCF hosts, which I think has some of this information on there. I see Andrew's on the call also.